Hello, friends of Studio Brûlé. This is Steve Brûlé and it's coffee time. Today, we are going to be discussing, getting again into the cancel culture and the attacks on freedom of speech on universities across the Western world. And we have a distinguished professor emeritus from the McGill University with us, a professor from the anthropology department, who was just recently under attack by these same self-appointed censors. In this case, a letter was written with the request or the demand that the university remove his emeritus status. These issues, these are deeply concerning events in our world because it does represent the accelerating nature of the suppression of freedom of speech and cancel culture. With no further ado, I'll bring in Janice Fiamengo, who's with us as well, and Professor Salzman. Janice also is quite familiar with the carryings on or the cancel culture and freedom of speech issues on campuses throughout North America. So bring them right in here. Hello, folks.
Hello.
Hey, great to see you guys again. And Professor Salzman, can you give us a brief overview of how this all materialized, how it came about?
Sure. Since I retired 2 years ago, after 50 years of teaching anthropology at McGill, I started to write more public interest articles about the state of universities, about various aspects of the society, about the development of various ideologies that we're seeing come forth. And they were, from some points of view, they were controversial, because the point of view that I take is liberal, is classical liberalism. I believe in individuals, I believe in freedom, I believe in freedom of speech, I believe in tolerance, and those things are increasingly not acceptable in some circles. And anthropologists have said, ever since there was a book that came out in 1985 called Anthropologist as a Cultural Critique. And the idea was that anthropologists should feel authorized by their backgrounds and their knowledge, not only to do descriptive and analytical analyses on the subjects of their research, many cases foreign, but also could be more local, but also could use their background to critique that culture and to critique our own culture as well. Most of the anthropologists that took up that challenge critiqued our society from a left-wing perspective. When I started to critique our culture, I did it from a classical liberal point of view. Let me give you an example. We spend a lot of time now talking about categories of people. We're very concerned
Identity
about
politics, yeah.
Well, even beyond that, we talk about men and women. We want to assess relations between men and women in those general categories, between whites and people of color, between heterosexuals and gays, and so on. And I've criticized those larger categories, saying that reducing individuals to some general census category was taking away their individuality, taking away their humanity, and that's not a good basis for organizing society. And people have felt that, yes, there should be social engineering based on those general categories. But to me, that suppresses individual diversity, which is something that most people don't talk about when they talk about diversity,
Right.
and also intellectual and opinion diversity, which is something that they not only don't talk about, but want to suppress. Now, I wrote an article about the Middle East for a general audience. My own background, I'm a specialist in Middle Eastern anthropology. I lived in the Middle East. I lived in the deserts of southeastern Iran, an area called Baluchistan, for 27 months over a 10-year period. And I've written extensively on the nature of the people that lived there. They were tribal people, Islamic tribal people. They were nomads. We lived in tents. We moved around. And I got to know that area quite well. And of course, I've read widely in Middle Eastern anthropology and Middle Eastern history and so on. So in this article, I said that the Middle East is a place where people had to be ready to attack and be cruel to others, because the structure of tribes is one of balanced opposition, and your group is defined in opposition to another group. It's a little complicated because you can be in small groups or big groups according to how you define your relationships, but it's always balanced against an opposed group. Well, today you're not allowed to say a discouraging word about any group that is not your own. It's politically incorrect to criticize another culture because we now believe, allegedly, that all cultures are equally good, and multiculturalism demands that we not criticize any other culture, that no culture can be deemed to have problems that we recognize. There's an exception, of course, and
Right.
that's Western civilization, which is a terrible, destructive, cruel, and horrible culture. But all the other cultures in the world are terrific. They're also, in addition to. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to wonder, do you have a kind of a quick assessment as to why it is Western culture is the only culture that Western cultural people are allowed to criticize? That's a kind of a self-hatred kind of thing going on there, isn't it?
Well, part of the idea is that that you can only assess using your own cultural framework, and your cultural framework does not apply anyplace else. Every place has got their own culture and their own values and their own criteria. So it's not legitimate for you to take your values and criticize other people in another culture. That's one argument. But the other argument is that unlike any other culture in the world, our culture was especially corrupt. We have Western culture was imperialistic, colonialistic, racist, based on slavery, and we are horrible. The world, so the story goes, and this argument is generally labeled post-colonial theory. The argument is that in the world, everybody really got along well and nicely with one another, and everyone was kind. Everyone was was peaceful, and everyone
Do
was
you
tolerant.
know what hour? Do you know
Un-
what hour of what day and what year that actually happened?
Well, this is post-colonial theory is not a very historical point of view.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
but the idea is the world was a perfect, lovely place until the West invaded and destroyed all that beauty and imposed racism, imposed hierarchy, imposed cruelty on all of these innocent people around the world.
Yeah.
As you suggest, Steve, uh, it totally ignores the history of hundreds of empires, of slavery going back thousands of years, of levels of cruelty um, unimaginable in Western society. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's not exactly a fair or balanced historical assessment, but it's what they say, and it's
Mhm.
what it's now a. I think it would be fair to say that post-colonial theory is the dominant theory in the social sciences today,
Yeah.
and what I say about anthropology applies to all the social sciences and the humanities as well.
Yeah.
Where did post-colonial theory come from? Who brought this about? What group of people?
Well, I think Edward Said was a major contributor to that,
Hmm.
and
Yeah. An English scholar, English literary studies has an awful lot to answer for.
yes, Said wrote a great deal. He was a great hero of some Middle Easternists. Uh, he wrote a lot about the Middle East, although his specialty was Jane Austen.
Mhm.
Um, and so he really didn't have any
Okay.
grounding in Middle East studies, except that he'd been born in Egypt and claimed to have been a Palestinian.
Yeah.
But his anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism played very well with other Middle Easternist scholars, especially those who derived from Middle Eastern lineage themselves, and who had taken over the Middle East Studies Association, which was the main scholarly group in North America. So let me go on with my story. I published this article, and some students at McGill came across this, and they were offended. Now, in this article, I didn't just say that these terrible things happened in the Middle East. I also talked about some of the parallel terrible things that happened in the West, things like the endless wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, uh, and so on. So it was in fact a reasonably balanced article and grounded in my research in the Middle East. But that line about Middle Easterners being obliged to be cruel to others offended them, and they decided that if I said stuff like that, I shouldn't be a professor anymore. I shouldn't be I shouldn't be listened to. And then they looked a little more into my work and they found that I'd said unacceptable things about multiculturalism, for example, and which
Yeah.
I took a position that um, it really was multiculturalism was not an accurate description of our reality here in Canada, uh, which was based on two founding cultures. And my analysis is very close to the official analysis in Quebec, which is called interculturalism. Uh, Not only that, but public opinion shows that Canadians generally agree that that immigrants should adopt the culture of the Canadian mainstream. So while what I said was extremely out of line for left-wing academia, it was what it's basically the same view as Canadians generally have.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had the temerity to say that I didn't think we have a rape culture. This was terribly shocking to them because this is a matter of faith. But I happen to know something about culture because culture is the central concept in anthropology, or at least it used to be. And I've argued extensively that if you know what culture is, then it's nonsense to say that we have a rape culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, all of this was deeply offensive, and so 4 Muslim groups, 2 anthropology groups, and the executive of the student society that includes all McGill students wrote an open letter denouncing McGill's free speech policy and denouncing me in specific, listing all of these topics on which I had violated political correctness. But it was helpful of them because they gave links to my articles with each of those denunciations. So people, if they were interested, had a chance to actually go and read the articles. I'm not sure how many of the students that signed that letter actually did read those articles or read them in any very serious way. So this then became public. They demanded that McGill revoke my emeritus status. They didn't really understand why people have emeritus status. People receive emeritus status because they've earned it, because they've worked for the university, contributed to the university, they've contributed to their field of study, they've published, they have international reputations. That's why when you retire, you get emeritus status. So to say that we don't like what he says, just take it away, raises the question whether when we read something that one of our previous students have written, can we revoke their degrees?
Yeah.
I'm not, or if students in the course of their studies say things we don't like, can we revoke credits from them?
Mm-hmm.
Is that really what they had in mind? I'm not sure. And I certainly wouldn't favor that.
Well, they might favor that for other students,
For
not for
other students,
themselves.
of course. Yes, that's right. They'd have to be the judges
Yeah.
of that. And that does raise a difficult question. Who decides what's acceptable and what isn't?
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why academic freedom and free speech exist, because nobody wants other people to be in charge of their thoughts and speech. They justified this demand by saying that these racist and Islamophobe comments made McGill students feel unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
This unsafe thing has become the boogeyman, the go-to attack for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting because even in the offending article on the Middle East, race was not mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and nor was Islam mentioned.
Right.
So they're certainly reading in quite a bit to their criteria for being offended is very flexible.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing letter, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't read it, you can find it easily We can post a link to it too. It's just called, if you put into Google open letter to McGill University or something like that, it'll come up and read. I mean, we went through it a couple weeks ago, maybe in too much detail. I mean, it's complete with a trigger warning right at the beginning that they're going to be discussing issues of racism and Islamophobia, and students are encouraged to be careful and to decide how they will engage with the open letter. I mean, it's just an amazing revelation of the thinking of presumably, elite student bodies at Canada's top university, including the graduate students, the Anthropology Graduate Students Association, the future academics in anthropology. It is just a remarkable revelation of their thinking, and it does include links to Professor Salzman's articles that I would encourage everyone to read to see what kind of even-handed, balanced, well-documented, fact-based, thoroughly researched articles offend these snowflake Jacobins. It's just amazing.
Janice, I think you're...
One of the things that always comes to mind... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think Janice is absolutely right. What's really important in this brouhaha is not me and my emeritus status. What's important is the mentality of the students that wrote it. Because, as we like to say, children are the future. And our students are the future of academia and the future of the country. And this mentality of the students, it was a revelation. It was a revelation of what kinds of assumptions they make, what they think they should be able to do, how the university should run, what rules we should follow. And I think I think that it's very helpful to hear from them and to know what they have in mind, because what they have in mind is extremely dangerous.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is red guardism.
But we've been seeing this.
Yeah,
we've been seeing this for possibly decades. I have to say, I can't say it was a revelation to me to see what's going on with you, Professor, because we saw it with a lot of other professors, and we've seen it at Janice's lectures at various different universities, the University of Toronto, Queen's University, Ottawa U. The same attitude. And it raises the question for me, especially when I hear this trigger warning. This letter is purportedly written for the eyes of academics, or at least academics and people who are studying to become academics, and they need trigger warnings. What kind of intellectual culture do we have where you have to have a trigger warning for an idea to academics? It's absurd.
Well, it's something that students have been demanding for years now, and many professors do issue trigger warnings in their course materials. If there's anything in the course material that they think are could possibly trigger someone, whatever that means. I mean, I don't even know what that means. Presumably it means that the person will have some sort of deeply traumatizing emotional reaction to the material and will not be able to get out of bed to attend class for 3 weeks. And so, I mean, there's a serious discussion on university campuses all across North America about what should be done for students, how they can be accommodated if they have these emotional reactions.
They should take a different
material.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they should be accommodated. Like, if they're not mentally strong enough to go to university, why are they allowed into university in the first place?
Well, exactly.
I think we've lowered the bars for so much stuff in our culture now that it's almost like everybody has a right to be a rocket science if they just decide to. When
I was being sued by the student at the University of Ottawa, I spoke to the diversity officer at my university, and she told me about all sorts of cases about students who have alleged various types of disabilities and including kind of like they're not even real things, but psychological, emotional types of disabilities, and some very real disabilities, and in the attempt to accommodate those students, allegations of disability, all sorts of degrees have been awarded to students who have not actually completed the requirements of the program. They have not taken the exams, or they have not taken the exams in the ways that other students have taken the exams. They have not submitted the assignments, etc. And all of this sprang from the very well-intentioned passing of a piece of legislation saying that no student should be prevented from pursuing education on the basis of disability. And I think most of us would agree with that. It would be horrible if somebody, a blind student, were prevented from obtaining a degree. Of course, that person should be accommodated, but it's then been extended and extended and extended over the past 15 to 20 years to accommodate all sorts of things, including these emotional disabilities, so that people don't have to read information that triggers them. We now have, I've heard from law professors talking about how they aren't able to teach rape law because students say that it triggers them to hear the word penetration in class, all sorts of bizarre things. And these people are graduating, they are going into the wider culture, they are implementing those same policies, ideologies, attitudes in their workplaces. I mean, the HR departments of offices and workplaces all across the country are now run by people who believe in these kinds of things, who believe that people should be protected from anything that makes them feel unsafe. So we are creating a victimhood, we already have created a victimhood culture in which all sorts of double standards are being practiced, and in which quality and merit are sacrificed for the person who claims their victimhood loudest. It's quite astounding, and we have allowed it to happen, and it's now fully entrenched all across the culture. So it's just amazing. I mean, I was surprised, to bring it back to our particular subject, I was surprised to see that McGill University actually made a fairly, I'd like to ask you, Philip, what you think of this, but McGill University finally responded to the open letter by these aggrieved students and actually made a pretty good defense of academic freedom. Given the context, they actually said, we do support academic freedom, and we will not be removing any emeritus professor honorific at the present time. It certainly wasn't as strong and uncompromising as I would have liked to have seen, but I was surprised that there was a defense of academic freedom there at all.
Well, yes, the central demand of the students was that McGill rewrite their academic freedom statement in a way acceptable to these students, and basically they said that, look, there's an incompatibility between inclusion and academic freedom, and therefore we have to rewrite our statement on academic freedom to give priority to inclusion. And their definition of inclusion is that no one should be forced to hear or read something that they might disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
So they're basically saying there should not be academic freedom at all, that only certain ideas acceptable to them should be allowed in the university, and that
how do we get
should be banned.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get to a point where students have been given this idea that they can dictate how the universities are run? We're talking, a university is a place that you're supposed to go to learn from masters. But we've flipped this thing on its head, and now the students are telling the masters how and what they should be teaching.
We've given them a bunch of
completely
tools.
Upside down.
We've given students a bunch of tools. If they accuse a professor of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia. Almost any of those things can put a professor at risk. The university is committed to being inclusive, and so accusations like that carry a great deal of weight, and that's why professors and teachers all around North America are losing their jobs because students, and not that many have to complain. One or two complain to the dean.
Yeah.
And what about the hundreds of thousands of students who don't like this situation?
Yeah, too bad for them.
Millions.
Well, they're not activists, and they don't speak up, and they don't want to be this. They don't want to be accused of those things. They're afraid of being canceled.
Yeah,
canceled socially.
It's totalitarianism.
Listen, a student was just thrown out of. I can't remember which university, a Canadian university, because he spoke out in favor of the right to life.
Yes, that was at the University
from Edmonton.
Yes, that was Zaki, I think his name was, at the University of Manitoba in the medical school there. He had posted in Winnipeg, University of Manitoba, a very large medical school there. He had made some Facebook posts about the right to life and the right to bear arms. And a few students complained, saying they felt very unsafe around him. And that was the end of him, essentially. He even wrote letters of apology.
That's right.
Wasn't he also
thrown out of the program?
I think
he was thrown out because his letters of apology did not indicate that he had changed his thinking about these issues.
That's it. He was kicked out ultimately because they wanted him to admit in writing that his beliefs have changed, and he said that his beliefs hadn't changed, but he had written these profuse apologies. So this is the first example, I think, of where they're punishing a student because of his beliefs, even if he doesn't speak out about his beliefs again.
Yeah, it wasn't enough that he wrote 20 letters of apology, I think. And one of the people who had apologized was the dean of equity, or whoever it was who was hauling him on the carpet over these posts. It was his daughter. So there was an obvious conflict of interest and obvious bias against this student, who was a Coptic Christian from Egypt, and who said his family came to Canada because they sought freedom of religion. And now he finds that here they are living in Canada, and he doesn't have freedom of religion, or at least he's not allowed to express any of his principles and values based on his religion. So, I mean, it's just a horrific example, but I'm sure it's the first one we know about, but I'm sure it's not at all unusual. I mean, students are forced to renounce their beliefs all the time in universities across Canada. I knew quite well as a medical student at the University of Ottawa, who told me about how the University of Ottawa Medical School had set up a snitch line so that students could anonymously complain about other students if they expressed views that those students declared were hurtful or discriminatory or harassing. And that meant that if somebody didn't like somebody else, usually a conservative student, a pro-life student, a religious student, a religious Christian or Jew, that person could be complained about and would have to go and answer to a tribunal, wouldn't even know who had complained about them, what the specific complaint was. But, people would take screenshots of other students' Facebook posts and would tinker with them to make them look worse than they actually were, and then would complain about them, and the student would have to explain that she hadn't actually posted that. And it was just awful. It finally ended only when the student organized a few of her friends, and they flooded this snitch line with complaints about the other students. And ultimately the tribunal couldn't deal with all the complaints that came in and had to give up on the notion altogether. But in most cases, it's isolated students being targeted. Most students just want to keep their head down and get their degree and, leave with their life still intact and a few friends and their reputation not completely destroyed. So the mass of ordinary students do not fight back. and the zealots win the day nearly every time.
There was a case reported on
Incredible.
by Tucker Carlson last night about a special needs teacher that shared somebody else's question, which was, do all Black lives matter? What about Black unborn babies? Do they matter? Because they seem to be slaughtered at large numbers and everybody's happy. And what about Black policemen? Do their lives not matter? Is it okay that they be attacked and injured and murdered?
Mm-hmm.
So this special needs teacher who had worked, I don't know, for 18 years or something, was fired because the board said, well, this question was incompatible with their philosophy.
Yeah.
So
Incredible.
it's happening all around, and people are being they'll try and destroy you if you say the wrong thing. Now, I had nothing to lose. I'm not a particularly brave person, but I'm not a vulnerable person. I'm already retired. You don't get anything with emeritus status. And I figured, look, what's the difference between writing emeritus professor of anthropology and canceled emeritus professor of anthropology? It wasn't a big
deal. In today's world, that might be a step up. It might be a badge of honor.
These days, yes, certainly with some people.
Because no, really, being a canceled person means that you had the strength of your convictions. You know.
Yes, of course. McGill, to be fair, did come out with a letter and said, look, there's been a lot of discussion, and we are committed to inclusion and equity and diversity, but a university has to be committed to academic freedom. And emeritus professors have earned that label, and differences of opinion are not a basis for disciplinary action. And so basically, they made a general statement. They didn't mention me in particular, but they basically dismissed the letter, saying they were standing pat with the statement that they had. They weren't going to do anything to anyone for voicing an opinion that somebody else didn't like. I have to say that I've had tremendous support from various different fronts. The Canadian Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship wrote a very strong letter to McGill. The National Association of Scholars in the U.S. Wrote a very strong letter to McGill and put up a counter petition, which is gained, I don't know, something like 3,100 signatures so far. The Free Speech Union in Britain put up another counter petition, and it has over 1,500 signatures. And I received many personal communications from people asking if they could help in any way and offering their support. One of my colleagues at SPME, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, Richard Kravats, wrote what I thought was a brilliant and devastating reply to the open letter. I'm grateful for that statement. It was published widely in not mainstream media, but
yeah,
I like to put up this. I like to put up this quote from you, Professor Salzman. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit. I'll just read this out for our audience. What is important is what has happened to our universities. They are now reaping what they have sown. The students are thinking and saying what they have been taught. we are witnessing no less than the fall of Western civilization. That's a pretty strong statement. I think I certainly agree with. But would you like to comment on that somewhat?
Look, you can't blame the students entirely for their ill-conceived ideas. Where do they get those ideas? Well, they get them from their professors. They get them from the books that those professors assign. They get them from the reinforcement they get from their professors and from the university. They get them from the political commissars that all of our universities have appointed. They're infamous diversity and inclusion officers whose job appears to be to suppress unacceptable thoughts and send people with those thoughts to re-education. It's appalling that our universities, and many of them have spent millions upon millions on these officers at every level of the university to ensure thought and speech conformity to the shibboleths of the left.
Yeah.
It's absolutely shocking. We thought that we should bring China into the world system so that they become more like us. But in fact, what's happened is we're becoming more like China.
Yeah.
We're adopting various of the Communist Party patterns of party discipline, and imposing them on at universities and in the school systems and in the general public. And one example of this, of course, is critical race theory, which does not really have any empirical grounding. It's really just it's made up, and there are dozens of empirically based arguments to contradict it, but they're not interested in truth. They're interested in advancing their vision of diversity and their extreme vision or their statistical vision of equality. Equality of outcome, whatever people are like.
Yeah. It's, it really is astounding. It's been going on for many, many years. All of the signs were there. We had people sounding the alarm many years ago. Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind, which was about the takeover of the universities by a radical leftist agenda. He witnessed it in the late 1960s, and he saw how quickly university professors and even university presidents caved to these radical demands that social justice be the guiding principle of universities. And that was attractive to many, many professors. It made them feel a lot more relevant, certainly a lot sexier to say that you are dedicated to the overthrow of white supremacist patriarchy than to say that you study 16th century French poetry. And, so it was an extremely popular movement, and many well-intentioned sort of liberal professors said, okay, well, I don't really agree with this perspective, but I believe in diversity of opinions. And so sure, okay, let's hire this particular professor and we can debate these ideas. But in a very short time, the entirety of the department was taken over by professors whose ideological certitude meant that they were quite prepared to make sure nobody was ever hired who didn't share their beliefs. And that was the death knell of academic freedom, really. And we're seeing the results now.
Yes, that happened in my department. I supported and was enthusiastic about my self-declared Marxist and communist colleagues, my feminist colleagues, but then they wouldn't accept anybody else who didn't
Yeah.
support their views. And in my last years
So-
at McGill, my students said to me, you know, I don't hear things, you say things that I don't hear anywhere else in any of my classes
Yeah.
because of my outrageous liberal views.
Yeah. Yeah.
How much of this is coming from the women and gender studies programs? Like, they seem to me that they are the ones who introduced many of these ideas in the first place, starting with the affirmative action for women. When I was at university, shortly afterwards, I went back, I gave a lecture at the chemistry department, and an invitation from my previous professor. And at that time, this was in 1986, he was already lamenting the fact that they were not allowed to hire the best candidates anymore. They had to hire women in preference. So they had to dismiss all these highly qualified male candidates for professorships and hire women. Since then, there's more than 50% professorship in that chemistry department. And the dean is a female. And he was saying that this was coming down by edict within the university from the Women and Gender Studies Department.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that's true. I would say, though, that there are a lot of very smart women in anthropology. And we had a lot of, we hired women. They had to pass the ideological test, but they were very smart. I mean, I wouldn't complain about that aspect of it. What I would say is that the feminist framework of looking at society as a set of gender class or sex classes in which the upper class oppressed the lower class, that this neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist model has replaced the liberal vision of society as many individuals interacting voluntarily, cooperating in building families, communities, industries, voluntary organizations, political parties, and so on. They've replaced that, and where people were free and where people had options, and where justice was partly a matter of voluntary contractual association. Replace that with this idea of a class hierarchy and class conflict. And they've moved forward with that, not by trying to do away with the hierarchy, but by trying to flip the hierarchy and saying the future is female and now women should be in charge. So this neo-Marxist model has been adopted, of course, also by LGBTQ, etc., and also by race activists.
Yeah.
That, nothing good happens to anybody in America. It's just one race oppressing the other, and the other trying to flip that hierarchy. So, Steve, I agree with you that that the women's movement and the feminism and women's studies, and particularly the women's studies in universities, have successfully imposed this Marxist vision on our society, and it underlies these conflicts that somehow never seem to end and are totally lacking in the nuance of empirical reality.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Nope, I don't know where Steve's gone. Where are you, Steve? We seem to have lost Steve. Well, I wanted to ask you too, Philip. Did you find in your final years of teaching, when your students were saying to you, I hear things from you that I don't hear from other professors, when your department had essentially been taken over by the cultural Marxists, did you find that you began to self-censor to any extent? Like, did you feel that you were being cautious in what you said and what you taught, precisely because you were aware that a single student in your class who complained could create a lot of grief for you? I'm asking that because I did, to a certain extent, in the final years of my teaching. I started to worry a little bit. I remember once I was teaching a Canadian author named Rohinton Mistry. He is an immigrant from India, from Bombay. He's a Parsi person, and writes a lot about the Zoroastrian community in Bombay.
Did he write Family Matters?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And he there was a little blurb attached to his name in the anthology that I was teaching that said that his ancestors, the Zoroastrians, had originally been from Persia, but had been driven out of Persia into India by Muslims. And I felt uncomfortable even, saying that to the students, to introduce, mentioning anything about that, because I was worried. I started thinking, well, what if there's a Muslim student in my class who objects and says that this somehow made him feel uncomfortable or unsafe? And, so, all sorts of little ways I found that I was second guessing myself and slightly censoring what I would say in class, because I did begin to fear a little bit, complaints from students. I did have one big complaint that went to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, but had nothing to do with race or gender. Did you find that at all?
I in my particular case, I didn't. I was a senior person in the department. By that time, I had been there 46 years. Teaching for 46 years, and I had been appointed full professor in 1980. So I felt fairly secure, and my reaction was a little different, and that is I figured, people need to hear these things. So
Good for you.
I increased my efforts in those directions and on those questions a little bit more. But again, being relatively invulnerable, as I felt I was, and maybe I was wrong, but I felt I was.
I think you were.
But I think it's also true. When I was there, I found students, and particularly undergraduate students, to be pretty reasonable and pretty decent, and not malicious. Graduate students are a different matter. Graduate students are always a bit malicious, always a bit wanting to knock off the king, kill the bad, and they were almost always wrong. Graduate students are almost always wrong on any political matter. That's been my experience in the Department of Anthropology at McGill. But perhaps it's changed. I think it probably has changed as undergraduates have become more militant, have accepted these mandates from particular interest groups, alleged victim interest groups, and have become less tolerant as time has gone on. I consider myself very lucky. I was in anthropology when it was a real serious subject of study, and diversity was something that was enriching for a long time. That is diversity of opinion. And now it's largely gone. and it's been replaced by anti-Americanism, anti-white, anti-male, anti-Semitic views
Yeah.
that people regard as the highest virtue.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? It's very sad.
Very disappointing, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as you said, what's important is not our life or our view, but for Canada in general and for America too, these people are the people who are going to be the bureaucrats and the school teachers
Yeah.
and the legislators, the lawyers and the
Yeah.
doctors.
Yeah.
And so they're bringing these very destructive views into society. They're infiltrating the entire society. And I'm afraid that it's going to end up being a very conflictful and negative result.
Mm-hmm.
You see it in the U.S., where the country is absolutely split and there's no tolerance on either side for the other. I think Canada is quite split too, but not Canadians are a little more quiet.
Yeah.
Than Americans, but I think there's a lot of disagreement in Canada, and I think people are not really happy about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a bit muted because we've all been attacked by this Chinese communist virus.
Mm-hmm.
But when that's resolved, we'll see this coming out again. I don't see that destroying one of Canada's main industries in order to be virtuous or alleged yourself to be virtuous is going to be very constructive in the long run for Canada.
You mean the oil and gas industry in Alberta? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's amazing what the Trudeau government is getting up to. And I agree with you. I think there's a significant minority in Canada of people who feel that their views, their values are not in any way represented in the mainstream media, in the government, at the universities, in public schools, who are a lot quieter about their dissatisfaction than Americans, but who feel quite just disenchanted with Canada. I became quite good friends with a Canadian soldier who had served in Afghanistan, and he's now working as a military lawyer. He's hoping to perhaps be able to to bring some sanity to that system. There's an awful lot of military men getting themselves into trouble with women over false accusations of harassment and sexual discrimination, all sorts of crazy things there. But he said at one point, when we were just talking about the culture at large, he said that he was really glad he hadn't been seriously wounded or maimed for life in Afghanistan, because he felt now that the country he had willingly served and had committed to serve, even to the point of losing his life, didn't like him or his kind. And that was a very bitter feeling. And I think a lot of Canadians feel that way to greater or lesser extent.
I'm glad you mentioned the media, because I neglected to say that these are the people who are going to be editors and reporters. And what we've seen is the evolution of the press and the media from being opinionated to being biased to being wholly committed and activist on the left.
Yeah.
And there is virtually no. I gave up watching CBC 20 years ago when they were commiserating that the communists got voted out in Latin America.
Yeah.
To me, CBC is they're just expressing an ideology, and they have nothing to do with news or keeping touch with reality. It's gotten a little bit worse in the U.S. Where the networks and the newspapers and big tech are actively censoring stories that go against their party or their ideology. It's absolutely stunning.
It is. It is stunning. It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the CBC is such an interesting example, fully funded by our tax dollars. And it's an active force of sedition.
Yes.
It works every day to misinform Canadians, to turn Canadians against their own country, to imagine things about its deeply entrenched racism and misogyny that aren't true. To create division and to divide Canadians one from another and from their heritage. I find it shocking and despicable. And then I have to pay for it. Really bothers me too. Yeah. Anyway, are you still there, Steve? As Steve left us. I don't even know if we're still recording, quite frankly. I don't know what's happened to Steve. Anyway, well, we should probably bring this to an end, but I'm really glad that you spoke to us, Philip, and had so many interesting things to say. And I was pleased to see that the highest office at McGill University does not have any plans to remove your emeritus status. That's good, at least not in the short term. And wish you all the best. And if for anybody who's actually listening to this and hearing this still, if you'd like to take a look at Philip's work, he's written interestingly on many different websites for many different electronic publications, always relevant and fact-based and logically argued and informed by his wealth of knowledge as an anthropologist. And I always enjoy reading your stuff, and I hope more people will learn about you and read your work.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Steve and Janice, for having me today.
Okay, well, have a great week.
You too.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.